A thin line of blackened earth can rewrite the story of an entire civilization. Across the ancient world, archaeologists discovered distinct layers of ash and charred debris in the ruins of lost cities. These are not random piles of soot. They are critical forensic evidence known as burn layers. They are often the only physical record of a society's catastrophic and sudden end, yet they are famously complex to interpret. This is the central mystery. These layers of destruction are a direct window into moments of disaster, challenging our simple stories of gradual decline and forcing us to completely reconsider how powerful societies truly fall apart. By the end of this exploration, you will understand how to read these ashen pages of history, uncovering the profound insights they provide about the very nature of sudden, world-changing collapse. We will investigate what these burn layers really are, how they form, and the chilling stories they tell. Was this the work of a forgotten invader, a revolt from within, or the final gasp of a society pushed past its breaking point? What does the silence left behind by a great fire actually reveal about the people who lived through it? Think of a city not as a single structure but as a layered book of its own history. Each generation builds upon the last, leaving behind a new page of dirt, stone, and debris. A true archaeological burn layer is a page written in fire. It is not the gentle soot of a cooking hearth or the contained burn of a workshop kiln. Those are the punctuation marks of daily life. A burn layer is a screaming headline. It is a distinct, continuous stratum of concentrated destruction that cuts across an entire level of settlement. Its composition tells a violent story. You find thick, powdery ash, the final residue of everything that can be completely consumed. Mixed within are countless fragments of charcoal, the skeletal remains of wooden beams and furniture. There are fire-cracked stones, their surfaces splintered from intense heat, and sometimes, in the most ferocious blazes, you find materials that have undergone a terrifying transformation. Mudbricks can vitrify, their clay melting and fusing into a crude, glass-like slag. Metals might melt and flow, leaving strange, solidified pools. This is the signature of a conflagration that was too big, too hot, and too widespread to control. It engulfed entire city blocks, maybe the whole community, in a single, catastrophic event. But the true power of this ashen page is its position in the story. In the vertical sequence of ruins, the stratigraphy, it acts as a perfect, undeniable timestamp. It seals everything beneath it like a tomb, preserving a moment frozen in disaster. The layer of habitation below it, with its scattered tools, fallen pottery, and the footprints of daily life, represents the world just before the fire. Then the burn layer itself is the event, and everything above it, whether it is slow accumulation of wind-blown dirt or the fresh foundations of a new people, is the world that came after. This single, dark line in the earth is a full stop in history, followed by a long, uncertain silence. So what catastrophic force could write such a definitive and terrible ending? This dark line in the earth is far more than just debris. It functions as an archaeological event horizon, a point of no return in the timeline of a place. The principle is beautifully simple, grounded in the logic of how things accumulate over centuries. We call it stratigraphy. Imagine dropping a book on a table, then another and another. The book on the bottom was placed first, the one on top most recently. The ground works the same way. Layers of soil, refuse, and construction materials settle in a sequence, with the oldest at the bottom and the newest on top. A widespread burn layer is a single, violent page inserted into that stack. It was not laid down over generations. It represents a single, short-duration event, a fire that roared across the entire community, affecting every building, every street, and every person living there at that exact moment. This creates a profound time capsule effect. The burn layer acts like a seal, instantly preserving the world beneath it. The floor of a house is frozen in time, with tools left where they were dropped, a meal abandoned mid-preparation, personal items scattered in flight. All of it is encapsulated by the ash and charcoal that rained down. This allows for astonishing precision. Archaeologists can take a piece of carbonized wood from a beam that fell in that fire and subject it to radiocarbon dating. Because the wood stopped absorbing carbon the moment it burned, the test gives an almost exact calendar date for the catastrophe itself. It is not an estimate. It is a timestamp for the day a society's story was violently interrupted. So we arrive at the critical, haunting question: what specific event could create such a definitive, widespread, and terrible marker in time? The fire itself is just the symptom. We must diagnose the cause. Determining the cause of that fire is where history becomes a meticulous forensic science. The blackened layer tells us a disaster happened, but the specific evidence within it must answer a more difficult question. Was this a terrible accident or a deliberate attack? The distinction changes everything about the story we tell. To find the answer, archaeologists sift through the ash with a detective's eye, looking for patterns that point to intent. An accidental city-wide fire, perhaps sparked by a single lightning strike or a cooking flame that grew out of control, leaves one kind of signature. The burn pattern might radiate from a central point. The debris field would contain the tragic remnants of daily life, but typically not the tools of war. You would find collapsed roofs and charred household goods, but not clusters of arrowheads or spear points embedded in the walls. There might be no signs of a military assault, like breached fortifications or gates systematically burned from the outside in. Evidence for an intentional assault, however, writes a different, more chilling narrative. This is what we call a true destruction layer. Here, the burning is often strategic. Key structures of power, like a ruler's palace or a city's main temples, are targeted and utterly consumed. Defensive gates show signs of being set alight to gain entry. Mixed within the ash and collapsed masonry, archaeologists might find the telltale artifacts of conflict, like sling stones, bronze arrowheads, or the shattered tips of spears. In some cases, the resting places of individuals are discovered within the layer itself, and careful study can reveal signs of conflict. This combination of evidence, a widespread, hot burn focused on centers of authority and accompanied by weapons, paints a clear picture of a society ending not with a whimper, but with a violent, punctuated event. It is the difference between a tragic accident and a historical full stop, a moment where one chapter is forcefully closed so another can begin. This leads us to the next, even more profound layer of the mystery. If it was an attack, who was responsible, and what does the nature of the destruction reveal about the attackers themselves? The artifacts trapped within that ashen seal are the voices of the final moments. These are not treasures carefully buried for the future. They are the scattered, ordinary things of life, abruptly fossilized by fire and collapse. Their position and condition speak volumes. This is the concept of in situ, a Latin phrase meaning in the original place. Finding a storage jar shattered on the floor of a home, its contents spilled and burned, tells a powerful story. That jar was in use. It was part of someone's daily routine right up until the moment the roof caved in or the wall fell. Workshops become poignant time capsules. A potter's wheel might be found with an unfinished vessel still centered on it, the clay hardened by the heat of the blaze that interrupted its creation forever. Perhaps most telling of all is the presence of stored wealth and food. Discovering caches of valuable metals, jewelry, or stores of carbonized grain within a destruction layer is a critical clue. It means the fire moved too fast for people to gather their most precious resources for escape or for conquerors to systematically loot them. A society that sees a threat coming, whether an invading army or a slow environmental crisis, will take its wealth and food with it. They abandon carefully, but a layer filled with valuables left behind points to a catastrophe of shocking speed, one that overwhelmed the community's ability to respond. This starkly contrasts with archaeological sites that show evidence of a planned departure. In those cases, buildings might be found neatly emptied. Hearths are cleaned out, tools are taken, and only broken, worthless items are left in the corners. There is no widespread fire, just a quiet thinning out and then silence. A burn layer rich with in-situ artifacts is the opposite of a quiet departure. It is a snapshot of a world interrupted at its most mundane, a breakfast left uneaten, a tool mid-swing, a child's toy dropped in flight. This brings us to the most delicate and revealing inclusion of all, the evidence of the people themselves. The presence or absence of human remains within the destruction layer is perhaps the most poignant piece of the puzzle. Their discovery, when handled with the utmost respect by researchers, offers a direct, heartbreaking connection to the event. It confirms that the disaster was not just architectural but human, that the fire claimed lives in the very moment it consumed the city. The position and context of these remains can answer agonizing questions. Were individuals found in resting places, suggesting they were overcome while seeking shelter, or does the evidence point to a different, more violent conclusion? This fragile evidence moves the narrative from abstract collapse into the realm of immediate, personal tragedy, forcing us to confront the human cost written in the ashes. The presence of human remains within that ashen seal transforms the story from one of architectural loss to one of profound human tragedy. When found, these silent witnesses offer the most direct and undeniable evidence of a sudden, catastrophic event. It is critical to understand that such discoveries are not always present. In many burn layers, the absence of remains suggests that people may have had some warning to flee, or that ceremonial practices after the event allowed for the recovery and memorial of those lost. But when skeletons are discovered within the destruction debris itself, the narrative shifts dramatically. Their positioning tells a specific and haunting story. Individuals are not found in prepared resting places. Instead, they are uncovered in the streets as if caught in flight. They are found collapsed in doorways, perhaps in a final attempt to escape or to protect those inside. They are discovered crushed beneath the weight of collapsed walls and burning rooftops, forever pinned in the moment the structure gave way. This context alone speaks of a disaster that unfolded with terrifying speed, leaving no time for orderly response or escape. Forensic archaeology approaches these finds with immense respect, seeking understanding rather than spectacle. Researchers carefully document the position of each individual and study the bones for any signs of trauma. The goal is to read the story written in the skeleton. Certain patterns can indicate a cause, evidence of sharp force trauma, for instance, or the impact of projectiles points clearly to conflict. Perimortem fractures, those occurring at or around the time of passing, can distinguish injuries sustained in a collapse from damage that happened long after. The collective picture built from these careful observations is what turns a theoretical burn layer into a record of lived experience. Sites like tall El-Hammam in the Jordan Valley or the layer known as Troy 7 provide sobering examples. At these locations, the burn layer contains not just charcoal and melted mudbrick, but also the resting places of individuals whose final moments were intertwined with the city's destruction. The evidence suggests they did not perish from a slow illness or in their sleep. The context indicates they met their end amid extreme violence and societal collapse. This changes everything. A burn layer with such evidence is no longer just proof of a great fire. It becomes the physical signature of a day when the social order shattered, when the bonds of community were severed by overwhelming force and when countless personal stories ended abruptly. It forces us to acknowledge that the collapse was not an abstract historical transition. It was a visceral human event marked by profound loss. This realization then pushes us toward an even larger question. If the fire and violence were this complete, what could possibly follow? What emerges from the ashes, and what does that next chapter tell us about resilience, memory, and the relentless cycle of human civilization? Perhaps no single period better illustrates the power of the burn layer than the decades surrounding 1200 before Common Era. Across the entire eastern Mediterranean, from the coasts of Anatolia to the hills of Greece and the ports of the Levant, the brilliant civilizations of the late Bronze Age went dark. Their stories did not fade quietly. They ended in fire, and the archaeological record screams this fact in a unified, terrifying voice. At the great Hittite capital of Hattusa, a sophisticated imperial center, excavators find a thick, dark stratum sealing the final occupation level. The monumental gates are burned, the temples and palaces lie under collapsed, scorched masonry. Hundreds of miles to the south, at the wealthy mercantile port city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, the same story is written in the ground. A violent conflagration consumed its administrative buildings and its vast archives of clay tablets, some still in their sending chambers, as if a final warning never went out. Across the Aegean Sea, the mighty citadels of the Mycenaean world, like Mycenae and Pylos, share this fate. Their grand palaces, centers of a complex redistributive economy, were utterly destroyed by intense fire. The pattern is undeniable and chillingly synchronous. These were not random, isolated disasters spaced over centuries. The radiocarbon dates and the cultural sequences align to point toward a narrow window of time, a perfect storm of collapse that swept across an interconnected world. The characteristics of these burn layers are profoundly telling. This was not haphazard burning. The targeting was specific and strategic. In city after city, it is the nerve centers that are obliterated. The palaces where scribes kept records, the administrative buildings that stored taxed grain and distributed goods, the fortified citadels that housed the ruling elite, all bear the brunt of the destruction. At Hattusa, the fire was so hot it vitrified parts of the stone and mudbrick fortifications. At Ugarit, the fire reached the very archives, baking the last diplomatic correspondence into permanence even as it consumed the shelves they sat upon. This pattern suggests an attack aimed at decapitation, at destroying the very institutions that held these complex societies together. The simultaneous nature of these events across such vast distances, affecting multiple distinct cultures and kingdoms, forced historians to abandon simple explanations of local wars or dynastic squabbles. A local conflict cannot explain a regional catastrophe. The synchronicity of these dark layers pointed to a crisis of a different magnitude entirely, a systemic failure that rippled through the entire fragile network of international trade, diplomacy, and mutual dependence that defined the late Bronze Age. This evidence ignited one of history's greatest detective stories. What force could possibly explain such a widespread and coordinated pattern of civilizational ruin? For decades, the primary suspect was an enigmatic group referred to in fragmentary Egyptian texts as the Sea Peoples, often described as a confederation of raiders from across the sea who swept through the region, toppling kingdoms. The burn layers seem to fit a narrative of external invasion, of a tidal wave of violence that overwhelmed defenses. Yet the archaeological picture is rarely so simple. While some sites show signs of conflict, others do not clearly show evidence of a new culture immediately replacing the old. The destruction layers are often followed by a dramatic cultural simplification, a loss of literacy, and a centuries-long period of much smaller, isolated settlements. This has led other scholars to look inward toward systemic vulnerabilities. Could a changing climate have caused prolonged drought and famine, straining these complex states to the breaking point? Could internal rebellions, fueled by inequality and the failure of central authority, have erupted simultaneously, or was it a catastrophic combination where external pressures exposed fatal weaknesses in a hyper-specialized and interdependent system? The burn layers do not give a single, easy answer. Instead, they present us with a stark, undeniable fact of simultaneous, targeted destruction, and then step back, forcing us to wrestle with the complex interplay of external shock and internal fragility. They tell us the what and the when with stunning clarity, but they leave the why as a haunting, open question, a reminder that collapse is rarely about one villain, but about a web of pressures that finally snaps. Across the ocean and centuries later, a different kind of collapse left its own signature in the ash. During the 9th century of the Common Era, the great Maya cities of the Central American rainforest entered a period scholars call the Terminal Classic. Here, the burn layers tell a story not of foreign armies storming the gates, but of a society turning its fire inward. At the heart of majestic cities like Tikal and Cancuén, archaeologists uncovered evidence of intense, focused burning right in the ceremonial cores. The pattern is distinct. Instead of a widespread inferno that consumed entire urban landscapes, the flames were directed with startling precision. Royal palaces, the very seats of divine kings, were systematically set alight. Monuments, especially the tall stone slabs known as stelae that recorded a ruler's deeds and divine right, were toppled and their surfaces scorched by fire. In some cases, the burning was so deliberate it appears ritualistic, a methodical dismantling of symbols rather than just a destructive frenzy. This evidence paints a portrait of collapse that is revolutionary, not invasive. It suggests a profound rejection from within. The Maya collapse was not marked by a single, synchronous fire across the region, but by a rolling wave of internal upheaval. At Cancuén, for instance, the city's end came not with a siege, but with what appears to be a targeted event in its central palace complex. The pattern of burning and damage indicates a specific attack on the institution of kingship itself. This changes how we interpret the ash. When you find a burned palace but the surrounding residential areas are relatively untouched, you are likely seeing the physical result of a failed social contract. Theories point to a combination of intense pressures that eroded the king's divine authority. Prolonged drought, as revealed in lake sediment cores, would have undermined the ruler's promised ability to commune with the gods for rain and prosperity. Resource scarcity and growing inequality could have fueled deep-seated resentment among the populace and the lesser nobility. The burn layer in the palace is not just evidence of a fire. It is evidence of a tipping point. It represents the moment when the people or a rival faction physically and symbolically destroyed the central pillar of their own world. The burning was an act of erasure meant to break the spiritual and political power of a dynasty deemed to have failed. Following these events, the Maya lowlands did not see a new culture move in. Instead, the complex political system of competing city-states fragmented. The population did not vanish, but it dispersed, leaving the grand ceremonial centers to be reclaimed by the jungle. The burn layers here signal a revolutionary collapse, a conscious uncoupling from a system that could no longer sustain its people. This stands in stark contrast to the Bronze Age scenario, showing that a dark line of ash can be the signature of a society consuming its own heart. A final, fiery act of rejection that writes a very different, but equally definitive, end to a chapter of history. Yet the very clarity of a burn layer can be its greatest deception. That sharp, dark line in the earth creates a powerful illusion of a clean break, a single catastrophic day when everything changed. It tempts us to see history as a series of dramatic before and after snapshots, but collapse is almost never that simple. The fire is the exclamation mark, not the entire sentence. The most profound challenge for archaeologists is to see past the dramatic final act and uncover the slower, quieter story that preceded it. A burn layer can act like a perfect seal, but it can also function as a mask, hiding the gradual decay that made a society fragile in the first place. The conflagration represents the final, terminal shock, but the real mystery often lies in the vulnerabilities that accumulated over decades or even generations, the cracks in the foundation that allowed a single spark to bring the whole structure down. To understand a true collapse, we must learn to look beneath the ash. What might we find there? Evidence of a society already simplifying, contracting, and struggling long before the flames arrived. Imagine a grand city in its final years. The burn layer will show us its last day, but the archaeological levels directly beneath it, the decades leading up to the fire, can reveal a different kind of story. We might see signs of economic strain, perhaps imports of luxury goods like fine pottery or rare metals begin to dwindle and then disappear, suggesting broken trade networks or a loss of wealth. The variety and quality of locally made goods might decline, a sign of specialized craftspeople leaving or no longer finding patrons. We could find evidence of population decline, entire neighborhoods within the city walls slowly abandoned, their buildings left to crumble, their streets filling with wind-blown silt long before any invader approached. There might even be signs of prior, smaller-scale destruction that was never fully repaired, like a section of a defensive wall that was patched haphazardly with rubble instead of rebuilt properly. These are the symptoms of a body politic growing weaker, of a social contract fraying at the edges. This changes how we interpret the fiery end. A society in robust health can often withstand a shock. It can rebuild after a bad harvest, fend off a raid, or recover from a political assassination. But a society already weakened by internal stress loses that resilience. The final attack or the accidental blaze becomes the straw that breaks the camel's back precisely because the camel was already overloaded. The burn layer, in its terrible finality, can inadvertently hide this crucial context. It freezes the moment of death, but it can obscure the long illness that led to it. For example, at some sites in the ancient Near East, the glorious palaces sealed under ash show stunning wealth. But just below that floor, archaeologists sometimes find thinner walls, smaller rooms built into once grand courtyards, and repairs made with cheaper materials. This suggests the elite were already retrenching, their power and resources diminishing. The magnificent final occupation level might have been a facade, a last gasp of grandeur before the implosion. The fire did not destroy a society at its peak. It consumed one that was already hollowing out from within. Therefore, the most accurate picture of collapse comes from reading both the punctuation and the prose. The burn layer gives us the undeniable when and the shocking how of the end, but the layers beneath it, carefully excavated and analyzed, reveal the why. They show the slow motion unraveling, the droughts that stretched for years, the political instability that paralyzed decision-making, the inequality that fractured communal solidarity. The fire is the catalyst, but the tinder had been gathering for a long time. This forces us to shift our perspective from a simple story of invasion or disaster to a more complex and perhaps more unsettling understanding. Sudden collapse is rarely truly instantaneous. It is usually the violent culmination of a prolonged decline, a point of no return reached after a long series of quieter crises. The burn layer marks the moment the thread finally snapped, but to see why it snapped, we must look to the weight that was already upon it. This realization leads us to an even deeper layer of inquiry, beyond the physical ruins themselves. So what does the world look like just before that final, fiery punctuation mark? The layers of earth directly beneath the burn seal hold the answer, a quiet record of mounting strain. Here, archaeologists sift through the dust of normal life, searching for the subtle tremors that foreshadow an earthquake. they are not looking for weapons or signs of battle yet. Instead, they find evidence of a community beginning to buckle under pressure, making difficult choices and compromises that reveal a slow erosion of stability. One of the most telling signs is the state of a city's defenses. In the decades before a collapse, you might find evidence of rushed, shoddy repairs to once proud walls. A section of finely cut stone fortification might be patched with a haphazard pile of rubble, field stones, and even broken pottery. This is not the work of a confident, resource-rich kingdom maintaining its borders. It is the work of a society cutting corners, scrambling to address threats with limited time, labor, or materials. The message is clear: the external danger was perceived as imminent, but the central authority no longer had the capacity for a proper, organized response. The very fabric of daily economics also frays. In these pre-collapse layers, the quality and diversity of material goods often decline. Pottery, a common archaeological marker, becomes a powerful economic indicator. Where once a vibrant market might have offered fine, thin-walled vessels painted with intricate designs, the pottery from the final years can be thicker, clumsier, and devoid of decoration. The explanation is not a loss of skill, but a loss of specialization. The potter can no longer afford to spend days on a single beautiful pot. They must produce simple, functional ware quickly to meet basic needs. Imported luxuries, exotic shells, rare stones, distinctive foreign ceramics disappear from the record. The long-distance trade networks that once brought wealth and ideas are snapping, leaving the community increasingly isolated and inward-looking. Perhaps most revealing of all are changes in what people ate. By analyzing animal bones and plant remains, scientists can reconstruct ancient diets. A society under severe stress often shows a narrowing of food sources. Where the elite once dined on a wide variety of meats and grains, the diet may contract to a few hardy, reliable staples. Evidence of famine foods, like wild plants not typically eaten in good times, begins to appear. The bones of butchered animals might show that every last bit of marrow and sinew was extracted, a sign of intense nutritional pressure. These are not the signs of a sudden catastrophe, but of a prolonged squeeze, a gradual tightening that affects every household. This contextual analysis is what prevents a fundamental misinterpretation. If we look only at the burn layer, we see a dramatic, singular disaster. But by reading the chapters that came right before it, we understand that the fire was not the cause of the collapse. It was merely the final, catalytic event. The society was already a patient in decline, weakened by political instability, economic contraction, and environmental hardship. The invasion, the revolt, or the accidental blaze was simply the shock that a frail body could no longer survive. The burn layer is indeed the exclamation point, but the sentence it concludes is one of quiet desperation, accumulated hardship, and fading resilience. This shifts our entire perspective on historical collapse from a spectacle of destruction to a sobering study in vulnerability. The vulnerability of a society is written not just in its politics, but in its very landscape. A burn layer requires fuel, and the most abundant fuel for any ancient city was its own architecture. In the arid regions where many of these civilizations flourished, the common building materials were a perfect recipe for catastrophe. Timber frames supported roofs and upper stories, while walls were made of sun-dried mudbrick. In normal times, these materials provided excellent insulation and were readily available. But during a prolonged drought, this everyday architecture could transform into a towering pyre waiting for a spark. The wooden beams, starved of moisture, become tinder-dry, losing their natural resistance to flame. The mudbricks themselves, made of clay and straw, bake in the relentless sun until they are little more than brittle, combustible blocks. A city in the grip of a megadrought would not just be thirsty, it would be sitting in a vast, interconnected tinderbox. A single lightning strike, a cooking accident, or a torch thrown in conflict could ignite a firestorm that would race through streets and leap between rooftops with terrifying speed. Furthermore, the very crisis that made the city flammable also crippled its ability to respond. Fighting a major fire requires one critical resource above all else: water. In a time of severe drought, the public wells and cisterns might be perilously low or even dry. The communal effort to form bucket brigades from a distant river becomes a logistical nightmare when the population is already weakened by hunger and preoccupied with survival. The environmental conditions did not just create the fuel, they removed the primary means of defense. This turns the burn layer from a simple record of fire into a stark indicator of ecological pressure. It becomes the physical manifestation of a society hitting a hard environmental limit. We can now move beyond speculation and actually prove this connection through science. Paleoclimatology, the study of past climates, provides the evidence. By extracting long ice cores from glaciers or drilling deep into lakebed sediments, scientists can read the planet's historical diary. These layers contain trapped pollen, dust, and chemical isotopes that reveal precise annual records of temperature and rainfall stretching back thousands of years. When researchers align this climate data with the radiocarbon dates from archaeological burn layers, a powerful and often chilling pattern emerges. At site after site across the ancient Near East and the Maya world, the timestamps of major destruction events cluster within periods identified as profound droughts. The correlation is too strong to ignore. The burn layer is not merely evidence of a bad day. It is the archaeological signature of a society pushed to the brink by a changing climate and then pushed over the edge by a single, catastrophic spark. The flames consumed the buildings, but the true cause was an ecological threshold that had been crossed, leaving a civilization with no margin for error, no resilience left to draw upon, and nothing but ash as its final chapter. But a fire set by your own people tells a completely different story. This is the critical distinction archaeologists must make when they uncover a layer of ash. Not all fires are equal. Some are acts of annihilation meant to erase, others are acts of reverence meant to transform. The difference lies in the pattern of destruction and the objects left behind. A conquest-leveling burn seeks total eradication. The goal is to make a city uninhabitable, to shatter its power and scatter its people. The fire is indiscriminate, consuming everything from the grandest temple to the humblest home. It is chaos solidified into the archaeological record, but a ritual termination is a fire of precision and meaning. Here, the burning is selective, targeted, and deeply symbolic. It is not about destroying a society, but about ceremonially ending a chapter of its existence. The evidence for a ritual fire is found in its specific focus. Instead of a city-wide inferno, flames are directed only at structures of profound cultural or spiritual significance. A temple might be burned, but the residential quarter next to it is left untouched. Monumental stelae, those stone canvases of royal propaganda and cosmic order, are toppled, their surfaces carefully blackened by fire before being buried. This is not random vandalism, it is a systematic dismantling of symbols. Often, these acts are accompanied by what archaeologists call dedicatory caches. As a final offering before the fire is set, people place meaningful objects into the foundations or in pits dug into the floors. These are not valuable items left behind in haste. They are deliberate deposits, sometimes including beautiful ceramics, carved jade, or other sacred items, placed as a closing gift to the gods or the spirits of the place itself. The aftermath is equally telling. Following a ritual termination, the site is often treated with a kind of respectful closure. The burned remains of the temple might be ceremonially buried under a layer of clean earth, creating an artificial mound that seals the sacred space. Or the entire area is simply abandoned, left to the elements as a place that has fulfilled its purpose and is now at rest. This pattern speaks of a community consciously deciding to move on, to leave an old political or religious order behind, but doing so with a sense of ritual propriety. They are not fleeing in terror, they are conducting a funeral for a way of life. This changes our interpretation of the collapse entirely. A burn layer from a ritual termination does not signal a society destroyed by an external enemy. It signals a society in transition, choosing to symbolically kill its old institutions to make way for something new, even if that something new is initially unclear. The fire is not an end but a transformative rite of passage. Contrast this with the scorched earth signature of a conquering force. Their intent is not transformation but eradication. The burn layer will show evidence of looting first, with valuables stripped away, followed by a fire meant to deny any future use. The destruction is comprehensive, targeting infrastructure like grain silos and water systems to ensure no one can return. There is no careful burial, no dedicatory caches. The message in the ash is one of contempt and finality. Understanding this distinction is perhaps the most crucial step in reading a burn layer correctly. It moves us from asking what happened to asking why it happened. Was this a society violently interrupted by an outside force, its story cut short by conquest? Or was it a society that consciously performed its own symbolic ending, using fire not as a weapon of war, but as a tool of cultural renewal? The answer, hidden in the selectivity of the flames and the objects left in the ash, rewrites the final sentence of a civilization's story from one of victimhood to one of agency, from a tale of catastrophic defeat to a more nuanced narrative of deliberate, if difficult, change. The story does not end with the cooling of the ashes. To truly measure the scale of a collapse, you must look at what grows in the scorched earth. The archaeological layer deposited directly above the burn is the epilogue, a record of the aftermath that reveals whether a society experienced a terrible shock or a fatal rupture. This post-collapse horizon answers the ultimate question: did life here continue, and if so, in what form? The first, and perhaps most hopeful, scenario is immediate reoccupation. Here, the dark line of ash is quickly covered by new floors, fresh foundations, and the debris of renewed daily life. The pottery styles, architectural techniques, and religious practices remain essentially the same as those found beneath the burn. This tells a story of profound resilience. The fire was a catastrophe, but not an extinction. The community, or a surviving part of it, possessed the social cohesion, knowledge, and resources to return, clear the rubble, and rebuild atop the bones of their old world. The disaster was a punctuation mark, a devastating comma, but not a full stop. The culture's story carried on, perhaps with a newfound caution, but with its core identity intact. This pattern suggests the collapse was an external shock that the society, while wounded, ultimately weathered. A far more haunting epilogue is the long abandonment. In this scenario, the burn layer is not followed by new construction, but by the slow, silent accumulation of natural sediment. Wind-blown dust settles over the charcoal. Seeds take root in the cracks of collapsed walls. Over decades, then centuries, the ruins are buried under layers of sterile soil, becoming a true ghost town. This silence in the archaeological record is deafening. It signifies a rupture so complete that no one returned. The social fabric, the population, the very memory of the place as a home may have been scattered or lost. Such a gap often coincides with a regional depopulation, where not just one city, but many across a wide area fall silent at once. This points to a collapse of systemic proportions, where the disaster was not a single event but a cascade of failures, environmental, economic, political, that made large-scale, complex society unsustainable in that region for generations. The land itself needed time to forget. The third scenario writes a story of conquest and replacement. Here, after a variable period, a new culture moves in and builds directly atop the ruins. Their material signature is unmistakably different. The pottery is of a foreign style with new shapes and decorations. The architecture follows a different layout, perhaps using new construction methods. Even the dietary remains might change, showing a preference for different crops or animals. This layer speaks clearly of a power shift. One group's disaster became another group's opportunity. The burn layer now represents not just a fire, but a conquest so decisive that the original inhabitants were displaced, assimilated, or prevented from returning. The new occupants might even reuse stones from the old, shattered monuments in their own buildings, a physical metaphor for building a new order from the rubble of the old. Each of these three aftermaths, resilience, silence, or replacement, forces us to calibrate our understanding of the disaster. They move us from the dramatic moment of the fire to its long-term consequences, revealing whether a civilization was merely interrupted, completely erased, or deliberately succeeded. This final layer completes the sentence that the burn layer began. The most powerful clue can sometimes be what you do not find. We have explored how a distinct burn layer acts as a stark, undeniable signature of a sudden, violent end. But what happens when archaeologists arrive at a site of suspected rapid collapse and find no such dark line in the earth? The ground shows no widespread ash, no vitrified brick, no horizon of charcoal. This absence is not a dead end. It is a different kind of message, one that pushes the investigation toward causes of collapse that are less archaeologically dramatic but equally devastating. The lack of a universal fire forces us to consider alternative mechanisms for a society's rapid disintegration, events that can unravel a civilization without setting it ablaze. One profound possibility is a pandemic. A virulent illness can sweep through a densely populated city with terrifying speed, bypassing walls and armies. Its archaeological signature is not one of fire, but of quiet, heartbreaking absence. Researchers might find evidence of a sudden and dramatic drop in population. Burials could increase in frequency, with less care given to individual memorials, suggesting a community overwhelmed by loss. Abandoned homes might show signs of a hasty departure, with valuables left behind not because of violence, but because there was no one left to claim them. The social and economic networks that hold a complex society together, dependent on specialized labor and administration, can dissolve when too many key individuals are lost. A civilization can collapse not with a bang, but with a whisper of fading footsteps, its institutions hollowed out by an invisible enemy. Another invisible force is sudden economic disintegration. Imagine a society heavily dependent on a single, complex system, like long-distance trade in a vital resource. If that system shatters due to a political realignment or the collapse of a partner civilization, the economic foundation can vanish almost overnight. The archaeological record would show a sharp cessation of imports. Workshops for luxury goods fall silent, but instead of fire, you might find orderly abandonment. Buildings are emptied of valuables as people take what they can carry in search of new opportunities. The city is not destroyed, it is simply drained of its lifeblood, left as an empty shell when its reason for existence disappears. Perhaps the most poignant scenario is peaceful but rapid abandonment in the face of an ecological threat. A community living in a fragile environment, receiving clear signs of an impending disaster, might make a collective decision to leave. This could be triggered by a series of failed harvests, a dropping water table, or the advance of sand dunes. The evidence would show a planned exodus. Structures are not burned but carefully closed, tools are gathered, and only broken items are left behind. The departure is so complete that the site appears frozen in time, a snapshot of daily life interrupted by consensus rather than catastrophe. In each of these cases, the absence of a burn layer is itself the critical data point. It tells us that the agent of collapse was not an external force wielding torches, but an internal or environmental pressure that caused the social fabric to unravel from within. Fire leaves a bold, black signature. Pandemic, economic failure, and ecological migration leave subtler traces, whispers in the bones, the empty storehouses, and the neatly swept floors. This challenges the very image of collapse we so often hold. We are drawn to the drama of flames and fallen walls, but history teaches us that a civilization can reach its end just as definitively through silence, through dispersal, through the slow-motion shattering of the bonds that make a community function. The missing burn layer is a reminder to look beyond the obvious, to listen for the stories told not by what is present, but by what is conspicuously gone. The blackened soil of an ancient city is a crime scene waiting to be read. Today, the same forensic science used to investigate a modern house fire is unlocking the stories sealed within these millennia-old destruction layers. This modern lens transforms a simple observation of ash into a reconstructible event, allowing us to virtually walk through the disaster. The core principles are universal. Forensic investigators at any fire scene begin by mapping the burn patterns. They look for V-shaped charring on walls to locate a fire's origin point, study how materials melted or cracked to gauge temperature, and trace the path the flames took as they consumed available fuel. Archaeologists now apply this exact methodology to ancient ruins. By meticulously mapping the distribution of ash, charcoal, and fire-damaged artifacts across an entire site, they can start to answer precise questions. Was the fire concentrated in one district before spreading, suggesting a single point of ignition? Or do multiple, separate hotspots appear simultaneously, indicating a coordinated attack with many torches? The intensity of the heat left behind provides another critical clue. In a modern fire, melted plastics and twisted metal beams testify to extreme temperatures. In an ancient one, the evidence is found in transformed earth and stone. When a mudbrick wall is subjected to intense, sustained heat, the iron-bearing minerals within its clay can realign with the Earth's magnetic field at that moment. This fixed signature, studied through a technique called archaeomagnetism, allows scientists to not only date the fire but also to create a thermal map of the ruins. Areas that show this magnetic realignment were subjected to much higher temperatures, often pinpointing the heart of the inferno, perhaps a storeroom filled with oil or a palace packed with wooden furnishings that acted as a superfuel. Similarly, the study of vitrified material, where clay or stone has melted into a glass-like state, requires temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, a clear indicator of a ferocious, fuel-rich blaze. By combining these physical clues, a startlingly detailed picture emerges. We can begin to distinguish between a fire that burned slowly and incompletely, perhaps after looters had already stripped a building of its wooden fixtures, and a fire that raged with explosive intensity, fed by everything in its path. This forensic approach turns abstract ash into a narrative of minutes and hours. It lets us see not just that a city burned, but how it burned, street by street and building by building, revealing the terrifying speed and strategy of the catastrophe. Yet this compelling forensic picture comes with a crucial warning. The very drama of a burn layer can tempt us to see a clear story where the reality is far more ambiguous. Interpreting these ashen pages requires a disciplined skepticism, a recognition of the many ways our modern eyes can misread the ancient evidence. One of the most common pitfalls is mistaking a natural disaster for a human one. A massive wildfire sweeping through a dry landscape and jumping the walls of a timber-rich city can create a destruction layer nearly identical to one left by a conquering army. The pattern would be widespread, the heat intense, and the human cost potentially just as severe. Without clear artifacts of conflict, like weapons among the debris or signs of targeted looting, it becomes incredibly difficult to distinguish a tragic act of nature from a deliberate act of war. The silence of the evidence can be misleading, pointing toward a peaceful society overcome by a random catastrophe when the truth might involve conflict or vice versa. Another layer of complexity involves time. That unified, dark stratum in the ground creates the powerful illusion of a single, cataclysmic day. But what if it represents not one fire, but many? A city under prolonged stress might suffer a series of smaller, devastating blazes over a generation, each one destroying a neighborhood or a palace. As people rebuild atop the rubble, these separate events can merge in the ground, compressed by time into what looks like one great horizon of destruction. Archaeologists must be detectives of stratification, looking for subtle seams within the ash, for thin layers of wind-blown soil or repair between burn episodes, to see if they are reading one headline or the compiled summary of a long, painful decline. This leads to perhaps the most significant bias of all, preservation. History, as uncovered by the trowel, is not a neutral record. It is filtered through what survives. A society that ends in a spectacular fire leaves behind a vivid, sealed capsule for us to find. Its dramatic end ensures its story shouts across the millennia. But a society that unravels peacefully, whose people gradually disperse and whose wooden buildings simply rot away, leaves a far fainter trace. The quiet transition, the peaceful migration, the slow cultural evolution, these processes are archaeologically subtle. They do not create the bold, dateable, and emotionally gripping layers that fires do. Consequently, our view of the past can become skewed toward stories of sudden violence, simply because those stories are physically better preserved. They are the loudest voices in the room, and we must consciously listen for the whispers. This is not to diminish the power of burn layers, but to properly contextualize it. They are an indispensable, thrilling piece of evidence, a direct window into moments of profound crisis, but they are never the whole story. A true understanding emerges only when we weave that dark line together with all the other threads. The pollen cores that reveal climate, the animal bones that speak of diet and economy, the settlement patterns that show population movement, and the subtle changes in pottery and tools that hint at social shifts. The burn layer asks the urgent question. The rest of the evidence, often less dramatic but equally vital, helps us frame the answer. It reminds us that collapse is a mosaic, not a monolith, and that the final spark always lands on a landscape prepared by a long and complex history. So the final task is to weave all these disparate threads into a single, coherent story. This is the delicate art of synthesis, where the scientist must become a historian, and the historian must think like a detective. The process begins by laying every piece of evidence on the same chronological map. The stratigraphy provides the foundational timeline, the immutable sequence of before, during, and after. Upon this framework, every other data point is carefully placed. The radiocarbon date from a charred roof beam gives the fire a calendar year. The analysis of pottery styles in the layers below reveals how long the community had been producing that specific type of ware, hinting at cultural continuity or isolation. The animal bones and seeds tell a story of what people were eating in their final years. Was the diet diverse and rich, or narrowed to a few desperate staples? The paleoclimate data from a distant ice core or lakebed offers the environmental backdrop. Was this a time of punishing drought or unusual cold? And if human remains are present, the respectful forensic analysis can indicate whether trauma was part of the event. Each of these is a single voice. The stratigraphy says when, the artifacts say how people lived, the bones say what happened to them, the climate data says what the world was like around them. The true narrative emerges not from any one voice, but from the conversation between them all. For instance, if the burn layer dates to a year of severe regional drought, and the bones show signs of nutritional stress, and the pottery shows a decline in quality, and the stratigraphy shows shoddy repairs to the city walls, then a powerful, multi-causal story takes shape. This was not a healthy society struck by lightning. This was a community already straining under ecological and economic pressure, its resilience worn thin, making it vulnerable to a final, shocking blow. That blow could have been a raid it could no longer repel, an accidental fire it lacked the water to fight, or an internal revolt sparked by desperation. The burn layer is the exclamation point, but the sentence it concludes is written by all these other, quieter forms of evidence. Comparative historical records, like fragmented inscriptions from neighboring kingdoms or later mythologies, can sometimes provide a name or a motive, a claimed victor or a remembered cataclysm. But archaeology often provides the ground truth, confirming, contradicting, or deeply complicating the written word. The ultimate revelation of a burn layer, therefore, transcends the spectacle of the fire itself. Its true power lies in exposing the intricate web of a society's vulnerabilities. It shows us that sudden collapse is almost never truly sudden. It is the violent culmination of a long accumulation of stresses, where social contracts fray, political authority weakens, economic networks fail, and environmental buffers disappear. The fire is the match, but the tinder had been gathering for generations. By reading the ash in concert with everything beneath and around it, we learn a profound lesson about resilience. A society's strength is not measured in the height of its walls or the wealth in its temples during times of peace. It is measured by the depth of its resources, the flexibility of its institutions, and the solidarity of its people when faced with prolonged, compounding crises. The black line in the earth is a grave marker for a world that could not adapt, a permanent reminder that the difference between a catastrophe and a mere setback often lies not in the shock itself, but in the condition of the society that receives it. That dark line in the earth is never just a layer of ash. It is a conversation between what we can see and what we must infer, a dynamic archive of catastrophe that forces us to grapple with the profound complexity of how civilizations end. These burn layers deliver an unambiguous message to history, one that challenges the comforting idea that societies always fade away slowly through gradual decline. They provide concrete, physical proof that historical change can be shockingly abrupt, a reality sealed in charcoal and melted stone. This evidence compels us to move beyond simple stories of invasion or disaster and to confront the intricate web of environmental pressures, social tensions, and political failures that make a society vulnerable to a single, fiery punctuation mark. In doing so, these layers perform a remarkable act of preservation. They freeze the most traumatic moments, yes, but in that terrible stillness, they also humanize the past. They capture the abandoned meal, the unfinished pot, the hurried footsteps across a courtyard, connecting us across millennia to the lived experience of people facing an unimaginable crisis. The true significance of a burn layer, therefore, lies in this dual nature. It is both a stark scientific datum and a poignant memorial. It tells us that collapse is not a theoretical concept but a real event with a date and a temperature, while simultaneously reminding us that history is written by individuals whose stories were cut short. This leaves us with a final, resonant thought about the nature of civilization itself. Our study of these ruins reveals a recurring pattern of fragility, where complex systems can be undone by a convergence of stresses. Yet it also reveals an enduring thread of resilience, seen in those who returned to rebuild atop the ashes or who carried their culture forward in a new form. These blackened strata are not just tombstones, they are also testaments to the cyclical nature of human endeavor, to our capacity for both catastrophic failure and stubborn renewal. What historical mystery or moment of sudden change captures your imagination? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue unraveling the past together.